It says sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled folk used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there, he learned that he had been in this condition for a long time. He asked him, "Do you want to get well?" That's quite a question. Do you want to get well? No, I've just been hanging around here for 38 years. This is kind of my thing, you know. Jesus asked him, "Do you want to get well?" And listen to his reply. I'm reading from the New International Version. He said, "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one. I have no one." For 38 years he's been lying here. No family, no friends, just his only companion, his misery. And yet Jesus, out of all the people there, zeroes in on this one man, this one pathetic creature who has spent all this time suffering. Now, you know, in the older Bible translations, it says that at a certain time, angels would come and stir the water, and the first person who got into the pool was healed. Now, the more recent translations don't have that. Aren't you glad? Wouldn't you hate to worship a God who made healings and miracles some kind of contest? First one in gets healed? Oh, no. We don't worship a God like that. And so, Jesus said, "Would you like to be well?" He said, "I don't have anybody to help me into the pool. I don't have anybody to bring me anything to eat. All I get is what people, don't eat themselves." And so Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." And the Bible says at once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. Unbelievable. This is the kind of person Jesus is. He zeroes in on one pathetic person who hasn't moved in 38 years, and he heals him. And he healed him on the Sabbath. And you're not supposed to be healing him. A remarkable guy. Let's go on to John chapter 8. Here's another familiar story. At dawn, Jesus appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered round him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. You've heard this story. You know how this goes. Here's Jesus teaching. Everybody's paying attention to him. All of a sudden, this commotion. What's going on here? These men drag this disheveled woman and throw her down in front of Jesus. This woman was caught in the act of adultery. By the way, the law in the Bible commands that both the man and the woman should be punished. But here's this woman all by herself. Evidently she was committing adultery with herself. I don't know. I don't know how a person commits adultery without anybody else, but here she is committing adultery. These Pharisees, these teachers say such a woman should be stoned. That's what the Bible says. So what do you say? They were there to trap Jesus. If he said, let her go, then they say, okay, you don't care about the law. If they said, okay, let's kill her, they'd say, well, then you're taking the authority that belongs to Rome and usurping it for yourself. So he asks them, who of you hasn't sinned? If you haven't sinned, go ahead, throw a stone. Let's see what happens. And then he stoops down and begins to write in the dust. Nobody knows what he wrote. All we know is that as people looked over his shoulder and saw the words that appeared in the sand, each one of them started to disappear, from the oldest to the youngest, until at last nobody was there, and he was able to stand up and say to the woman, where are your accusers? I don't know. And he said, neither do I condemn you. Go and live in peace and sin no more. What a guy. Now let's see, we've had Jesus talk to a woman who's caught in the act of adultery. We've seen Jesus heal a man who was crippled for 38 years. We've seen Jesus talk to a Samaritan woman who'd been married many times, to a ruler of the synagogue. We've seen him as a guest at a wedding provide 150 gallons of wine. What kind of man is this? You see how easily Jesus moves among all these different types of people? He doesn't just move among the disciples, but he moves among rulers and Pharisees and prostitutes and sick people. But every place he goes and every life he touches, people leave better off after they have met him. Unbelievable. Let's go to chapter 9 of John. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Now, this is an interesting question. His disciples had been with Jesus now for, months, years, who knows. But they believe that after all this time, they have a chance to ask Jesus a profound theological question. So they asked him, "Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Now listen, I've been to college, and so I know a little bit about life, but I don't know how somebody can sin before they're born. It kind of escapes me. Maybe it's possible, but the disciples understood this kind of cause and effect that the Jews back in those days understood. Somebody has to sin for somebody to be born blind. I mean, that's the way things work. You do something bad and you're punished. So here's a man born blind. He comes out that way. And the disciples want to know who sinned, this man or his parents. Now look at, and by the way, that's kind of a common human tendency. You know, whenever something bad happens, we want to have somebody responsible. Who's responsible for this? Who did something wrong? So if there's a plane crash, we have to know who did something wrong. If there's some kind of natural disaster, who was responsible for not preparing? And so this is a human tendency to try to blame somebody else. But notice what Jesus says. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. Then what did Jesus do? He healed the blind man. In other words, let's not quibble about who's responsible for what. Let's just say this. Let's just say wherever there's the result of sin in the world, there's an opportunity for Christians to do something to undo that thing. There's an opportunity for us to lift people's burdens. If they're down, we can do something to help that. That's what Jesus was all about. Not about assigning blame, not about condemnation. He was about lifting people up and making their lives better. And that's exactly what he did. Let's go on to chapter 11. Here's another familiar story. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. You know this story too. And you know that when Jesus heard the news that Lazarus was sick, even though he was only 2 miles away, he didn't go and see Lazarus. He stayed where he was for a few more days. And finally, when he did go to visit Lazarus, it was too late. Lazarus was dead. So Martha, Lazarus' sister, comes out to meet Jesus when she knows he's coming. And her words to Jesus are, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." I know. And then Mary comes along. "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died." Wasn't Jesus thinking? Didn't he know what was going on here? Didn't he understand the seriousness of Lazarus' condition? Instead, he knew all about it. But again, this was an example of Jesus using something bad and turning it into something glorious. So he goes to the cemetery, roll away the stone, and then he says, Lazarus, come forth. What an incredible person. Not only is he able to provide wine at a wedding, he's able to resurrect a man who's been dead for 4 days. Whew. If only we could be like that. Okay. John chapter 13. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Now listen to this sentence, and listen very carefully. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. He's coming to the end of his life. The crucifixion is just days away. In fact, hours away. And the Bible says, having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. What did he do? Did he perform a miracle? Did he give them a Bible study? Did he die for them? No, that would come later. But right now, listen. He got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Jesus' life is coming to an end. Within hours, he knows he'll be hanged on a cross. So what does he do to leave a lasting legacy for his disciples? He washes their dirty feet. What kind of Messiah is this? What kind of Messiah heals a blind man, raises a dead man from the grave, raises a man who's been sick for 38 years, vouches for an adulteress, talks to a Samaritan woman, to a leader of the Pharisees, who provides wine at a wedding? Not just a bottle or two, but 150 gallons. What kind of man is this? And then when he wants to demonstrate his love for his disciples, he washes their feet. He washes their feet. You know, one of